Hello, my quilty friends. It's time to put our blocks together. Welcome to my Block of the Week series, Patching the Hole in the Barn Door. I'm Stacy of Stacy Creates Stuff, and we are finally ready to start putting our 12 blocks together. If this is the first time that you have stumbled across my channel, welcome. And just know that there are 13 videos before this one as part of this series. So you can get caught up by watching those, and you can also subscribe to my email list to receive the blocks 1 week at a time so that you too can have all the instructions for putting this block together. Your instructions will include the finish of not only the lap quilt that I'm going to show you today, but next week's video will be showing how to put together a twin size and a queen size setting for these 12 blocks. But let's focus on today with a small lap size quilt. So here we go. Now, of course, you're going, but didn't you already make 12 blocks? And how come you're showing me like an illustration? Have no fear. Here is the finished quilt. And today I'm going to be walking you through how I put this quilt together. If you're already on the email list, then this morning you received the instructions, which include, of course, the illustration and also a coloring sheet so that you can lay out how you are making yours. Now, I chose to start with 12 fabrics for mine in a rainbow assortment. And I am sticking with that theme of rainbow for the lovely border that goes all the way around. Let me start by telling you what yardage you will need for this quilt. For the sashing, which are the pieces that go in between the blocks, both on the sides and the top and bottom of the blocks, you will need 3/4 of a yard. The posts, which are the little squares that connect the sashing, you will need to make a total of 20 2-inch squares. So that's 20 squares that are 2 inches size. I used about a fat 1/8 of this because I cut all of my posts from the same fabric. You could also just use scraps and make them all fun and colorful, however you want. The squares border, which is that lovely rainbow border that I have on my quilt, is made up of 134 2-inch squares. And I used my 12 rainbow colors, 11 of each color, plus I needed 2 white ones. I used one of the fabrics from my background, and I placed those squares in the opposite corners here, and that just allowed the rainbow to kind of connect with itself. There's no beginning and end. It just kind of keeps repeating. Your mileage is going to vary depending on the number of different fabrics you use. The outer border, I used 3/8 of a yard. And because my sashing and my outer border are the same fabric, I actually just needed a 1 yard total of those rather than 3/4 plus 3/8, which would be 1 1/8. For my binding, I needed 1/2 yard. And for the backing, if you're going to do a single fabric for the backing, you'll need 3.5 yards of fabric. I went the route of piecing my back together from chunks of the fabric that I had, which I used for the background of many of my blocks, plus the sashing and border prints as well. And so I just kept piecing pieces together. I have no idea exactly how much yardage I used for those. However, you could take a piece of fabric that's 2 yards long, and if you split that lengthwise, the longest way, so you have 2 pieces that are 2 yards long, but not the full width of a piece of fabric, then you could piece a long strip to widen that piece out and make it wide enough then to use as a quilt back. So that's an alternative if you're trying to save fabric. So 2 yards plus some scraps to fill in kind of a funky strip down the center is a pretty cool way to save yourself 1.5 yards of fabric. All right, let's get to the cutting instructions. From the sashing fabric, you're going to cut 11 2-inch wide strips, and those strips should be the width of the fabric, so about 40 to 42 inches. Once you have those 11 strips, you're going to cut them into 12.5-inch pieces. So the finished rectangles will measure 2 inches by 12.5 inches, and you will need a total of 31. So that 11th strip, you don't need to make 3 out of it. You only need 1. From your posts, again, you will just need 2-inch squares. And for your squares border, you will need a total of 134 2-inch squares. And again, they could be random, they could be in a rainbow order, they could be alternating, whatever works for you. For your outer border, you are going to cut 6 2-inch strips. For your binding, you are going to cut 6 2.5-inch strips. If you prefer your binding to be 2.25 inches, that's fine. Just cut 6 2.25-inch strips. If you are using a single fabric for your backing and using 3.5 yards, then you will cut the 3.5 yards in half to make 2 1.75 yard pieces. So let's talk about how we assemble this quilt. So you need to start by arranging the blocks how you would like them. I just happen to arrange mine in the order of the 12 blocks as I presented them in this series. I planned my quilt out from the very beginning since I knew what it would look like, and I planned my frames to go in rainbow order. Now, they certainly would look just fine scrambled around in any particular order. That works as well. So you just decide what order your blocks look good to you in. And the grid is 3 blocks across, and there are 4 rows. So once you have laid out your blocks, you can then go ahead and start sewing the blocks together in rows using the sashing pieces between the blocks. There is a sashing piece at the start of the row and then also at the end of the row. So it goes sashing block, sashing block, sashing block, sashing. I would go ahead and do that for all 4 rows. In between those block rows, there is a skinny row of sashing and posts. That row is assembled post sashing, post sashing, post sashing, post. You can go ahead and assemble a total of 5 of those rows. Now, before you sew the entire quilt top together at this point, I highly recommend sewing a top half and a bottom half. This will make that border of squares much easier to assemble. And I'll explain why in just a moment. So I assembled my quilt top with the sashing, row of blocks, row of sashing, row of blocks. And the bottom half of the quilt, I did sashing, row of blocks, sashing, row of blocks, sashing. Now it's time to assemble that awesome little border of blocks. I started by assembling the blocks that go across the top, but not the very first one and not the very last one from my diagram. Those will go attached when we attach those squares along the sides. You will need 28 squares to go from edge to edge of the quilt top thus far. Sew those together. Now, I ran into a little bit of an issue when I created mine, and that was that my strip of squares ended up being about 1/2 inch longer than my quilt top. What to do? Well, I just needed to come back and re-sew by simply just sewing a smidge in on just a few of the seams. Now, very nicely, the little row of squares is going to match up seam-wise with that sashing row that's at the top of the quilt top. So it's that first row of sashing starts with a post, which is the same size as one of the squares. And then you have this now 12-inch piece of sashing, since it's now sewn together. 8 squares should fit along that section. So if you lay it out, and you can kind of determine where you might need to take a little bit more of a seam allowance. If, when you've pressed your squares, they are shorter than the width of the quilt top, then you may have to unseam a few seams and reseam them a little more scantily than 1/4 inch. But you can use that sashing and post seams to help line things up. So once I did that one, that's how I determined that doing the side pieces in slightly smaller lengths was going to be much easier than that longer piece. So that same number of squares will also work for the bottom, and you can put that along the bottom part of the quilt top. So now you have a strip of squares across the top of your quilt and also across the bottom. So now let's go ahead and assemble along the sides. These are a little bit shorter, and good news is that I paid much closer attention to my 1/4 inch seams as I was sewing these together, and they worked out perfectly. So hopefully yours will as well. For the top, if you've assembled the top half of the quilt the way I instructed, you will need 19 squares for the left side and the right side each. And on the bottom half of the quilt, you will need 20 squares on both the left side and the right side. Each need 20 squares. And that is because the bottom half has that extra row of sashing. Once you have assembled all of that, you can sew the 2 halves of your quilt together. And you are almost there. It's time for the outer border. Yay! Now I made my outer border to finish at 2 inches because that matched the sashing size. And I really liked that ratio. If you wanted to make this quilt a little bit larger, you could make your outer border a little bit larger. You will need more fabric, and you will need, of course, wider strips. So how do you figure that out? Well, essentially, you will need 6 strips unless you get to a border that's probably 4 inches or wider, and then you might need a 7th strip. So you're going to take whatever measurement, make sure you've added your seam allowance, multiply that by 6, and that would give you the yardage. To be safe, you can multiply it by 7, and then you know you have enough. Getting back to how I constructed it, I took my 6 strips and I sewed them together. Now I did a miter joint where I sew on the diagonal in order to seam the pieces together. But you could certainly do a butt joint where it's squared off as well. I like the diagonal one because it's a little less stress on the seam when I'm trying to manipulate it to match the quilt side that I'm attaching it to. And also sometimes it's a little less noticeable depending on the fabric. Now, before I cut any lengths of this very, very long strip now, I've sewn all 6 pieces together, I need to measure my quilt top. So I've made sure that I have pressed everything as flat as it could be. I'm going to lay my quilt top on a flat surface. The first strips that I'm going to be sewing for the outer border are going to be to the sides. So therefore, I am going to measure along the left side of my quilt to see what that measurement is, also along the right side of my quilt, and then I'm going to take a measurement down the center of my quilt from top to bottom, so the longest length there. I'm going to take those 3 measurements, which hopefully are very close to each other. Mine were only off by anywhere from 1/8 to 1/4 inch. I'm going to add those 3 together. You can use a calculator. No shame in using a calculator. Then divide that by 3. That's going to give me the average length of my quilt top. That is the size that I'm going to cut 2 strips so that I can attach those to each side. Once I have that done and those are pressed, I'm going to again lay my quilt out on a flat surface. And this time I'm measuring across the top of the quilt, the bottom of the quilt, and through the middle of the quilt from left side to right side. I will take those 3 measurements, which again, hopefully will be very close to each other, add them together, divide by 3 to get the average, and then I will cut 2 strips that length. You can't measure when you first have it out before any borders are. Don't measure your top and bottom because you haven't added your side borders yet. And you want to make sure that you have that measurement included in there. So that's why you have to measure your quilt top 2 separate times. Now that I've sewn my top and bottom borders, I give it one more press, and then I go through and trim the threads. I sent my quilt off to be long arm quilted by my friend Lauren at Garden Girl Studios. Lauren is fantastic to work with. We had a video conference since I live many, many miles away from her. She's in upstate New York. I'm in Maryland. And we did a little Zoom call where we discussed what I was expecting to get from the quilting on my quilt. She asked fantastic questions. She also gave me some guidelines for preparing the backing, and I got it all packaged up and sent off to her. Now, I chose to bind my own quilt, but she does offer a binding service as well. For the backing, because I didn't have a single fabric that I liked to do for the whole back, I thought it was a perfect opportunity to use up some of these fun fabrics I had used on the front and add a little pop of color with another set of rainbow strips. So my backing was all piecemeal together, and I did make sure that I had plenty of width on both sides to account for the long arm quilting. Long arm quilters need a little bit more width and height in order to attach the tension clamps that they need in order to keep the backing taut while they are quilting. If you're going to quilt on your own home machine or hand quilt it even, then you don't need quite as much extra inches on the sides or top and bottom. But I allowed between 6 and 8 inches all the way around on each side. So 6 to 8 inches on the left and the right and the top and the bottom in order to give Lauren enough room to attach the quilt to the leads and also to put the clamps on for the tension. I personally think that a fun pieced backing just adds more joy to a quilt. It's really fun to flip a quilt over and be like, ooh, it's another whole thing going on the back. And I have a special bonus block for you. It's a little 6-inch version of the hole in the barn door. I'm going to use that as my quilt label on the back. You can also make 4 of them, and 4 of them sewn together, 2 rows of 2, can substitute for a full-size block. So if there's a block that you're like, yes, I'm never going to English paper piece, then you could swap that in for that particular block. To prepare my binding, I took my 6 strips, sewed them all together into one long strip, pressed them in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and rolled them up. I'm going to insert some footage of me putting the binding on. I machine sew the binding to the front, and then I am going to hand finish on the back, using a whip stitch to tack the binding down. If you decided to use a single fabric for your backing, which I think is fantastic as well, you're going to take those 2 1 3/4 yard pieces, and you are going to sew selvage end to selvage end. And this will give you a very long piece that is plenty wide. If you're sending this to your long arm quilter, you could send that backing piece as is, or you could go ahead and cut it down a little bit if you need to. Most long arm quilters will give you whatever leftover remnants that you have from trimming your quilt. So in all likelihood, you would get that fabric back, and probably in a more usable chunk than if you cut your own. In this lesson, I am not going to show you how to attach binding. I'm going to do a separate lesson all about binding so that it works as a reference anytime you're trying to do binding. And in the meantime, if you're ready to get going and you need a refresher for binding, there are a ton of videos on YouTube all about binding. I'm going to leave you with another look at the finished quilt, and I'll be back next week to show you 2 other settings you can use your blocks with. Until then, I'm Stacy of Stacy Creates Stuff. Bye!